Well, I don't know. I was the youngest of 4 kids,
Mm-hmm.
and came along pretty late, and so I was more with my parents, I guess you'd say, and more in their lifestyle,
Okay.
and at home alone, and
Mm-hmm.
we had a few neighborhood kids, and it started out with them, but I don't know.
Gotcha.
My older brother was not the most supportive guy physically for me.
Okay.
He always sort of lorded it over me because he was pretty good, and so so
Got
I
it.
tried other things, I guess. Yeah,
Got it.
yeah. So.
Interesting.
Well, the oldest was Marguerite,
That's right. Okay.
and she married a guy named Groat, Groat, and my middle sister, my second sister was Grace Helen. She married a guy named Porter, Porter.
Okay.
And
And your brother?
his name was Royal Milner Sorensen, M-I-L-N-E, my mother's maiden name, yeah. Of course, I was in the service for 3 years, and then went back to college when I got out and finished, so I was originally the class of 47, but I didn't graduate till 52 or something, 48. So,
Okay.
Yeah, so, anyway.
Okay.
And had 3 years in the Navy.
Okay. We'll get to that.
Okay. And anyway, right out of college, I was sort of looking for a job. I didn't have a plan, and so my first job really was with a telephone company, Pacific Tel,
Okay.
in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I was in their, what they call their management training program, something like that. And so they had me doing a bunch of stuff, working with the operators and getting to know the equipment, and it was in the traffic division, so it had to do with the communication, not the engineering part, but the traffic. It was broken down into traffic, commercial, and engineering, the company. Yeah.
Huh.
And so I was learning my way in that, and looking forward to getting married, because we planned all that. And after a few months, or I've forgotten now how long, not terribly long, I decided that wasn't for me, so I quit.
Gotcha.
And much to their consternation, because they had me in this special program, and you know, or so. But anyway, they didn't. I just gave it up, and I guess I was thinking of getting married, and I was busy commuting back and forth to LA, and I didn't on the streetcar, and I didn't like that, and the job wasn't very interesting, and so I just quit, and with no plan.
No.
Particularly. Well, I did. I guess I'd sort of thought, okay, I still have some GI Bill left, so I decided I'd go back to get my master's degree in psychology. So that's what I did, and Marge was a good sport about it, and she said, okay. So after we had the GI Bill, which wasn't a lot of money, but she was happy to work. She'd worked before she went to college, and she thought she was into women's ready-to-wear clothing. She worked for a little shop in Pasadena and loved that, and so on and so forth. But anyway, when we were living in Claremont, she wanted to go to work, do something, earn some money, so she went to the placement office there in the graduate school, and all they had were teaching jobs, and she'd never thought of that. But anyway, so I'm digressing. So she ended up getting a job teaching elementary school, and ended up enjoying it immensely. So so she did that and earned some extra money while I was going to graduate school to begin with, and so that we lived in Claremont for about 3 years or so, I guess, something like that. And I was settling in there as a job assistant to the Dean of Admissions for Pomona College.
Oh, wow, okay.
And I was bored to death because I couldn't find, they really didn't have anything for me to do, and the guy in charge of admissions, he didn't seem to want to delegate any of it. He was doing it all, and I didn't feel as though I was really accomplishing much. I'd show prospective students around campus and things like that, but I felt
Unused.
we loved living in Claremont. We bought a house and we were settled in, and but I just had I heard about a man I knew at CalTech who was coming around to interviewing people for jobs. So I thought, well, I'll go see him, and I sort of knew who he was, and so I had a long session with him. I ended up accepting a job with him, and that was Robert Gray, who was head of the Industrial Relations section at CalTech.
Okay.
So I wasn't in the other job very long, and I jumped into that, and then I was with him for 3 years. So.
Okay. Doing.
Well, we did, the whole focus of the organization was we were supported by private industry, subscribed to our service,
Okay.
and we did personnel services and did research and maintained a library and things of that kind in the whole personnel field at that time, and gave classes for supervisors to learn to do personal relations kind of classes, and certainly techniques for their job, how to work as a supervisor. So anyway, we taught those kinds of classes. And my boss was very talented, but at times could be an SOB, and probably rightly so, because I was young and naive at that point. But anyway, he had a reputation for blowing his top and losing his temper, and when then he had his good times when he was very pleasant and nice, and so anyway, I put up with that for a while and learned a lot on the job, I must admit. And then I decided what I really wanted to do was go back to school. So I quit that job. Well, I did actually I joined 2 or 3 other fellows. We had a little consulting business on our own for a while, but I found, excuse me, I'm skipping something. No, I went from that job at CalTech with Bob Gray. I had a chance to transfer to Jet Propulsion Lab. Okay. Originally in their personnel program at Jet Propulsion Lab. But then after I got there, it was sort of interesting. I ended up, at first the job was fun, and then I ended up being an accountant. Oh. I was in charge of all the checking the salaries, and it was all numbers and that sort of thing, not dealing with people. So I got a little tired of that and left that job to then go in with these other couple of guys, and we did some consulting, teaching classes back into the industry where I was teaching, that sort of thing. And that worked for a while, but then there wasn't enough income. I had to do something else. So I went went back to CalTech into their development program. They're just starting a capital expansion, and they wanted somebody that knew industry and also knew CalTech, and I fit that bill pretty well. So, because I knew the corporates and I knew LA well, and I knew CalTech, and so I was in the fundraising, I guess you'd say, working with the committees that were doing the fundraising. Like Arnold Beckman was head of the program basically, and I worked with him and other top executives as their support person, and getting them to go out and make contacts and raise the money. So, so then they accomplished their goal, and the program sort of fell apart, and I was trying to get a job somewhere in CalTech with the students or something related to the program there and in the dean's office or something, but nothing materialized. So that's when I went back to graduate school again.
Got it.
And decided to just go ahead and get my PhD and get into the teaching end. I thought I'd enjoy that.
And where did you go for your degree?
So I went to, I went back to Claremont, the
Okay.
graduate school in Claremont,
Okay.
and enrolled there. And Marge kept teaching to help support us, and I still had some GI Bill, and then I had part-time jobs that paid something, so we were able to scratch along. And Marge was a great support. She put up with all the moves and everything else. So, because then we moved back to before that I'd moved from Claremont to Pasadena, and then from Pasadena back to Claremont, and so back and forth. Anyway, once I got my PhD, I was on the interim. There was a period I was in the administration of the graduate school. We had a lot of things happen. The person who had been dean contracted Lou Gehrig's disease, and so he had to sort of withdraw from his jobs. And at that point, they hired a man who was a professor that I knew at the Claremont Men's College, and he filled in temporarily, and somehow I became well acquainted with him, and he hired me to come in and help him as sort of assistant dean. And then he retired, and at that point I was acting assistant dean or whatever, but I still didn't have my PhD. Wow. So it was sort of an awkward situation. Got my degree and was looking for a job, and at that point I was a member of the Western Psychological Association, and they had annual meetings and where you'd go and meet other people and apply for jobs. And so that's how I found out about the Cal Poly job, was at one of those sessions. Cool. Applied for that and was hired by the head of the department at that time.
Got it.
Went from there. So I started out there as an assistant professor in psychology at Cal Poly, and an associate professor in psychology. They let me come in as an associate professor, and then after meeting all the requirements, I was advanced to full professor, and took over at one point department chair, and because I sort of enjoyed the administration and the teaching, and nobody else in the department really did. So I just sort of eased into that, and then I did that for 8 or 9 years, I guess. I was chair, where usually people were 2 or 3 years, and then they didn't want to do it anymore. So I stayed with it. So anyway, it worked out okay. My grandfather came from Norway when he was 18. And he was, the story was, he was in that group. They came to this country and they wanted nothing to do with their home country. They wanted to become American, and the whole emphasis was that way. So my father was always sorry that he didn't learn more Norwegian or more about it, but he tried, but his dad just didn't want to talk about it particularly. So he didn't, and whether he had some brothers, I guess, but we really don't know what happened to him, what happened to the rest of the family or anything else. And then he married a woman who was born in Missouri, I think. And then anyway.
This is Grace or your grandparents?
No, my I don't know what my grandfather eventually. I never knew him. I never knew his wife. I didn't know them at all. and he ended up having 4 children, 4 boys.
Okay.
My father was one of those,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't really know much more than that. And my father was the oldest of the 4 boys in that family.
And how about your mother?
Well, I don't know. She was history. She was born in Missouri, I think,
Okay.
and
Did she look Caucasian? Did she look
she's definitely Caucasian.
European background?
Probably English and
English, maybe?
and yeah.
Okay.
She used to feel she had some English in America. I don't know. She didn't really know where she came from,
Okay.
you know. So she was just American and
Fair enough.
from wherever,
Missouri.
whenever. And her father was a cabinet maker or something,
Okay.
and nothing special. Well, I was brought us to as a Baptist.
Baptist, okay.
My family's
Uh-huh.
was a Baptist. Yeah.
Do you feel you still are a Baptist?
No.
Are you eclectic,
well,
Christian,
I
Buddhist?
suppose Christian. Yeah.
Christian, okay.
Always Protestant. You know, we
Mhm.
belonged to a number of different churches.
Mhm.
My Marge and I did, and
So you're
Presbyterian, Methodist. We've been there.
got it.
Unitarian. You know, the whole. Always just looking for church as a social sort of thing, I guess you'd say,
Mhm.
and yeah, trying to be a good Christian.
But
and-
you're still a believer. You're one that would say, is there a God? You'd say, probably.
I'm a good Christian, but I don't necessarily believe in all that goes
The dogma.
into the Bible and all that particularly. So yeah.
Fair enough.
I become more of a scientific realist, I guess. You know, that
Uh-huh.
we're part of a great universe and whatever. So it's an amazing thing, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any great single power necessarily. Who knows? It's so vast, so amazing, so that it exists at all. So it's I have to, if I stop and think about it, somehow there has to be some overreaching power to this whole thing. It's so complex and so it can't just be physical particles out there. I sort of feel there has to be something somewhere.
So there's a spiritual.
Yeah, my first, I guess my first pet that I think of, well, there were some cats, but I don't really remember them as kids. And then I had a dog. My first dog was called Speed.
Okay.
And he was at those times in Pasadena, we didn't have to have a license maybe a license, but you didn't have to keep him tied up or anything. So he ran the neighborhood and the town and everything. So
Wow.
and then when Marge and I were married, we adopted a cat one night coming back from the movies in Claremont, and from there on out we had all sorts of pets. And that was a cat named Smokey.
Okay.
And then our first real child was a dog that we bought as a puppy at a pound or at a feed and fuel store in Claremont, and raised that as practically a child. Yeah, he was great. We thought he was pretty special. His name was Kent, Kent.
Nice.
In fact, our good friends that had babies said, "Come on, it's time you had babies because you treat your dog as if it were one." So anyway, that was after, when Kent finally died, just old age and heart conditions, and for a while we didn't have a dog, and then the kids wanted a dog, and Craig and Robbie, and one day we were out in Carissa Valley, out just sightseeing, having a day out, and we pulled into a gas station, and here was a pickup truck parked there waiting for fuel or something, and it had all these little puppies in it.
Wow.
And so of course the kids got all excited. So anyway, we said, well, okay. So we found out there were more of them back where these people lived, and so we gave in and went, and then we couldn't just pick one, so we had to pick two, one for Greg and one for Robbie. So that's how we ended up with 2 dogs, which was a big mistake, but because they paid more attention to each other than the other did to us, so they were terrible to try to train at all. But anyway, so that was. But we lived through that one way or another, and
you had lots of cats, as I recall.
And we had cats all along. Then we had a period of Siamese cats when we enjoyed them, and actually we had a female. I've forgotten how we acquired her, but we had a very purebred female, and we ended up breeding her to a male that we knew the history of, and actually sold those kittens to relatives, friends that wanted them, and then we raised 1 or 2 of those, and they met untimely ends for one thing or another, and so eventually we were through with the Siamese and moved just to cats. But they were great pets. Got along fine with the dog, and so that was a real family situation. Well, my father's mother's name was Marguerite, and her maiden name was Wasson. Yeah, and I remember they had a small grocery store in Golden, Colorado. That's what the family lived on, and we were brought up. Anyway, so.
When you visited her, was she in?
Oh, well, she lived in. She was pretty dependent on my parents, so she had a little place in Pasadena and lived near there, and we used to go see her every Sunday, take her for a ride or whatever. But she was an old lady when she was in her 70s, probably. We used to treat her. My parents used to take care of her pretty much, and the electronic days, and he was well known internationally for power transmission and all that sort of thing. So
got it.
Yeah. They all lived near Pasadena. Okay. And when we had family gatherings, they would come. And the one uncle who lived in Salt Lake, he was next in line to my father, down, age-wise. They didn't have any children, but they lived in Salt Lake. But my parents were very close to them and very fond of it, and we'd visit them frequently, or they'd visit us and come out. He and his wife, and he was in sales for General Electric or something like that. Okay. Real nice couple. They were real fun people. And then that was the oldest brother, and the next brother was Dudley, and he and his wife lived in Pasadena, and they had one son, and then the youngest one was Alfred, and they had 2 boys, a cousin, so what it ended up being cousin 5 days older than I, and that was George Sorensen. And so all growing up years, they lived in Pasadena, and we'd see a lot of them, yeah. And he and I used to get together and ride our bikes all over. And in those days, you could do that safely in Pasadena, even though it was a busy city, but we could ride all over and did not think anything about it. So, so that was fun. Well, yeah, my mother, when she had me, she was in her 40s.
Yeah, your father
41 or something like that, and. She used to joke because I came along 9 years later, and at that point, well, I guess she was an embarrassment to my sister because women just didn't get pregnant.
Yeah.
And so she said, well, it kept her young because as a result of my age, she went back into PTA and all of that, and knew all these younger people, and so it kept her going, she thought, because she did volunteer. She never worked. She would, volunteer work at that point. And with my parents and
when you're young,
and I did, yes. I went to Sunday school regularly, and and my father was a deacon in the Baptist church, so he was very involved in Pasadena.
Okay.
And one of the things you became involved with was a church, and he ended up being in the Baptist church, and was very involved there, and with the YMCA and things like that. She was a homemaker, volunteer with the PTA, and she was involved in the faculty wives for newcomers, the young faculty. She became involved in taking care of the wives and new faculty and graduate students, and they used to have a lot of graduate students come to the house and things, so they were all involved in those kind of activities at CalTech. Since my father was a professor in those days, all during the Depression and everything, when a lot of people were struggling, he at least had a little income and was hired as a consultant by the Edison Company, and he'd go to New York to have jobs back there with GE, and so he was doing fairly well, relatively speaking. So, so we'd always go someplace for the vacation, summers or Easter or whenever we could. They liked to travel, and so we did a fair amount of it.
Got it.
15 or so, we'd go up to the snow and rent skis or something. Then actually I went on a ski trip to Mammoth before there was any Mammoth, when I was in high school. A friend of my brother's wanted somebody to go with him one year, and so he asked me to go. And we went up to Mammoth, lived in a little cabin, and that was quite an experience. So, vaguely, I'm sorry I don't remember. She would, when she was babysitting with me, and I was a little kid, she'd tell me stories about in the old days living in Kansas and the Indians, and living out in the prairies and Indians around, and they had interaction with them and one sort and another, and talking about the Indians and setting up. I don't know. I remember she'd tell Indian stories. I don't remember many details.
Was it?
I'd say it was warm. My father was very busy in those days, furthering his career, I'd say, and he was warm but never demonstrative. So, and particularly. No, he was around. He was around, or we'd go with him if he were traveling in the summer. But he was around home. But he was over at the college, or working there, and we had his high volts lab, and he was all into that, and giving lectures, and so he was very busy. And so I saw mostly more of my mother probably than my father, and she was very dedicated and tried to include me on everything. And and they were warm. They were always very, I found, very fair, and their treatment of me. To my brothers and sisters, I was a spoiled child, because I came along later when they had more money, and so I'd want things and I'd get them when the older kids had really had to struggle. And so anyway, my mother baked pies, I remember that. She was a good cook, and she cooked a lot in the kitchen. She always worked, and once in a while we'd have help come in, but she did most of it. And we had a pressure cooker, and she used that a lot. And then we used to have a little electric. In those days, it's like now a crock pot, I guess you'd say. It was an electric thing that they put pans in, and they could sit there and cook all day, that kind of. And it was sort of rare in those days. You didn't see it. Was because of my dad's electrical. He got one of those, and it was sort of special. I remember that. My household was always where all the relatives would come at Christmas and Thanksgiving, and my mother would put on a big feast, usually at my house, because my parents were better off financially, I guess, and so we had the big house, relatively big house, and put on then we had, there were 4 of us kids in the family, and so that was always the center of things.
So. As a teenager, did you ever get in trouble?
Not, I should have, but I didn't, let's put it that way. Because I probably did more drinking and that sort of thing than I should have, but I never got in trouble for it. And,
Gotcha.
anyway, so
Okay.
it was a disappointment to my parents in that many respects. And then I started smoking because my oldest brother and sister, they all smoked. So I started smoking when I was in high school.
Wow.
And but then I realized
Wow.
Marge and I stopped smoking when about the time the kids were coming along. So my mother was pretty self-educated. She hadn't gone to college, and I guess she went to high school, but getting into the academic life, I know was a big. She worked very hard at trying to fit in and be a part of it. You know, I think she maybe felt a little less successful at it than other. You know, because she wasn't educated beyond high school, and so she'd worked in a bakery as a young girl and things like that. So we were never rich.
You were
We
never
always
rich.
watched every penny.
Okay.
You know, but we appreciated a lot of good things, but it was always my parents worked hard and they tried to save and invested in the stock market and tried to make some money and invested in real estate and tried that to raise a little extra. And then Dad did consulting work to bring in extra money, so it was always trying to bring in extra money because the CalTech didn't pay much in those days. So yeah, well, Dad always wore a suit, vest, you know, and he had his gold chains and watch, and that he always, you know, it had things on it from organizations he belonged to or something. He always tried to look very professional. He tried to maintain an image, sort of befitting what he thought was his role, and never stylish, just a good dark suit, you know. And then Mother always tried to dress nicely and always wore stockings and heels and all that sort of thing. Nothing fashionable, but just, well, of course I'd taken other girls to meet my parents before.
Okay.
And so I was always eager to have my parents meet somebody that I was somewhat serious about. And so I was happy to take Marge and have her meet him. And 49, 50. About 1950, when we lived in Claremont. We'd been just married a short while. And I went to a doctor just for a physical. Nothing was wrong. And he said when my cholesterol was off the charts at that point. And so he was very concerned and said I'd better be careful. So at that point, our family stopped having eggs for breakfast and bacon and all that good stuff. Our whole diet changed. And from there on out, we became more diet conscious, I guess, and exercise. And I was able to keep it all under control without medication. So
that's great.
That sort of precipitated our whole lifestyle.
Wow.
Yeah. When something wasn't allowing, my father would say it was cattywampus. I don't know where that came from.
That's the word swell.
I remember hearing that, but of course in the 20s, that was the word. Yeah,
that was the word.
Things were swell. Yeah.
That's funny.
That was the jazz age kind of thing. My older sisters, things were during their lifestyle. Things were swell. When I was about a year old, we moved into it.
Okay.
And it was stucco, single. A one-story California bungalow.
Okay.
But it was architect design, so it was small, but it was a nice little, well-designed little house, and in Pasadena, and they were very proud of that and built it and had a very good-sized piece of property, and but a residential property in near CalTech, just half a block or so from CalTech campus.
My goodness.
The room I ended up with would have been the cook's room. It was off the kitchen.
Oh wow.
And but that was my brother's room, really. And there was a half bath off of that.
Okay.
And that we have a basement, you know, we had a basement in those days, and with the furnaces and storage and all that. And
What did you put on your walls in your bedroom? If you remember anything.
I don't remember anything particularly, because I didn't really have my own room as such until I was in, well, what, college, high school.
Wow.
College. And it was still my brother's room, or I guess, so I lived at home until he went to Stanford when he was in his sophomore year of college. So
Okay.
he lived at home, and then he still would come home summers and was working in the summers, and he'd live at home for the summer. And because he was working in Long Beach at Procter and Gamble,
I see.
so he'd live in Pasadena and for most of it, for those 4 years that he was at Stanford, 3 years.
Wow.
Then he got married in '39,
Huh.
and so once he was married, then he was gone, and I had the room that he had.
Got it.
And one of my sisters was still living, and she was off and on in that bedroom that the sisters had had, and
I see.
then it became sort of the guest bedroom, and, you know, so. I had a period where I was sort of into dolls, strange as it sounds.
I forgot to ask. It's here, dolls.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't remember that I slept with one though, or I had the one I remember when the eyes would open and close, and you know it was supposed to be a pretty fancy doll.
Okay.
We had an icebox when I was a kid. Yeah, I remember when we got an electric refrigerator. That was a big deal, but I don't remember. It was the old-fashioned GE with the thing on the top. You know, I remember that.
Wow.
Yeah, but that was, we were fairly late in getting that. I think, you know, it was expensive, and we were doing fine with the icebox. We had a thing called a cooler. It would bring the cool air up from the basement, and so it, you know, it had shelves with, you could put stuff in there and keep it fairly cool, and so that was sort of the cooling area. So. We'd make hand freeze ice cream. We'd do that in the summer. That was a big event. Yeah. We had a piano, and my mother played some, and I took piano lessons for about 3 years and was reasonably proficient to a point. And then I got busy going outside and didn't want to practice, and so that dwindled. It was not easy. I had to really work at it, but I learned to read music and all sorts. Went to my class at least once a week, you know, for piano and all that. So.